The latest NAPLAN results is the national testing of schools show that reading levels among Australian Year 9 boys has sunk to record lows. 11.5% of boys, that's more than 1 in 9, they didn't reach the national minimum standard for reading. That's twice the level for girls, which is less than 1 in 9. For Aboriginal students, it's much worse. Nearly a third of students not reading to the minimum standard. A third of students. And it's an even worse story with writing. Again, I mean, look how badly the Year 9 boys are doing. Nearly 20% not writing at the minimum level. And how much worse the Aboriginal students? 40%. 40%. And if Aboriginal students can't read and write properly, they are headed, in most cases, for a life of poverty. You can forget all this talk of Aboriginal parliaments and treaties and all that. That solves nothing unless Aboriginal kids go to school and do well. The Education Minister, given all that, I thought seemed remarkably relaxed about these figures today, saying, well, the expected worse from the COVID lockdowns that have stopped children going to school.
Well, to be honest, Kieran, they're better than I expected. These are the first results that we've got in since those big lockdowns in Sydney and Melbourne last year, and there were some pretty horror predictions about what this would all mean. What it shows is that in most of the categories, results are pretty stable. We have seen some drops in numeracy and literacy in Year 9 for boys, but also for girls. It's not clear whether that's COVID, but I suspect that that's a big part of it.
Joining me is Dr. Jennifer Buckingham. She's done years of study on how students learn best, following evidence, not ideology. She's now Senior Research Fellow at MultiLit, which is they're experts in effective literacy instruction, right up this alley. Jennifer Buckingham, it's great to talk to you again. The interesting thing for me about these figures, and I hope you can solve it, is that literacy in Year 9 is a real problem. Literacy at primary school is comparatively much better. What does that tell you? Have we finally adopted some of the things you were saying about phonics instructions in schools, or what is it?
Well, I suspect there are a number of factors, as there always is in education. But one of those, I think, is what you've pinpointed there, and that is that there has been some gradual improvements in the way that teaching of reading is happening in the early years of primary school, and we're starting to see the benefits of that now in Year 3 and Year 5, where there's been a positive trend over a number of years. Over the last 2 years, that's plateaued a little, so that's disappointing. And again, I suspect that's partly to do with not just COVID lockdowns, but then also the various consequences of, COVID isolation periods for teachers and all the kinds of chaos that we saw earlier in the year and towards the end of last year. And those benefits haven't moved through yet to secondary school.
Yeah, well, that's wasted generations. Honestly, the guessing at words and all that kind of thing, it's driven me nuts. But you mentioned other factors. Why is it that boys are doing twice as bad as girls? Is that in part something, is it just the way boys are made up, that girls are more verbal, tend to be more verbal anyway? What is it?
It's partly to do with there are developmental differences in the early years of school, which means that boys are more likely to struggle if they're not given really explicit and structured instruction in reading in those early years. And the kids that are in secondary school at the moment, lots of those did not get that kind of structured and explicit approach to literacy. And it's also been the case for a long period of time. And you probably remember there was a parliamentary inquiry into boys' education 20 years ago, looking at similar things. And some things haven't changed with respect to, boys' preferred activities. So even the ones who aren't struggling with reading often don't choose to read. It's not their preferred pastime in their leisure time, whereas girls tend to read more for enjoyment. So that doesn't have to be the case, but it is an expression of natural preferences. So it means that schools and parents need to really pay attention to that and try to be encouraging boys to read well and to read lots of different things, because otherwise, over time, the gaps in their knowledge, their vocabulary, their reading fluency grow, and it's much harder to close the gap as time goes on.
Look, that's such commonplace advice in one sense, but it is so valuable. Read to your kids, get it in early, because if they're behind in that, they'll be behind for a long time in their life. But for me, Jennifer, really sticking out from these figures is this: Aboriginal students, the literacy levels are terrible. I don't know if you've studied this specific subset of the problem, but what is the issue here? What is the solution?
Again, a few different things, partly to do with most of our Indigenous students who are struggling are in remote locations where it's difficult to get teachers to go and stay. So there's a high turnover of teachers and therefore inconsistencies. But also students from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families often come to school with English as a second language. And so they are starting a little bit behind in terms of their oral language, which means that learning to read is a little bit more, well, quite a bit more difficult. Having said that, though, with really good instruction, and you see this in schools where it's being done, that there doesn't really need to be that gap, that, reading can progress at the same rate as students in metropolitan areas and in outer regional areas with the right instruction and with consistent instruction and high quality teaching. So it's certainly not a fait accompli.
Jennifer Buckingham, Dr. Buckingham, I've been an admirer for many, many years of the work you do. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it.